So this might run a couple hours. Unfortunately, it's 24 pages, the first chapter. I'm going to try to do it all in one. I might have to go for lunch break though. This is the brighter side of this conversation. We're going to look at things that uplift, I think, and excite. The second section is going to be a bit more depressing. And the third section, I think, is more moderate. It's a balance point between that depressive aspect and the potentials integrated together. But yeah, let's look on the bright side right now, the developmental process. So why is development important? So let me give you a breakdown of the levels of development. It's important to keep in mind, and although there's indeed a hierarchical component to these developmental theories, if they are natural, that is actually inherent in our reality, then it's more skillful to know about these developmental levels, waves, or stages than to not know about them. Because if you consciously wrap your head around them, then you yourself will begin to spot them when they pop up in your day-to-day experience. And they will, furthermore, by actually knowing them, you will increase your own potentials of growth in them. So by knowing them, you'll probably grow. As you'll kind of recognize that there are higher and lower levels of consciousness, and that you can act in certain ways to help live into those expansive mental landscapes yourself, or not live up to them. You have that choice. At least you'll know the difference, right? So knowing about these levels of consciousness, in other words, will become a tool to deal with the realities we presently face, helping you to live into the more dynamic requirements you face moment to moment. So in this radically complex atmosphere, they might be a tool that you can use. And now I make this kind of silly story. Maybe it's not the best story, but it's fun, I think. And so let's use it, I guess. The story of a man, his family, and his bees. A man comes home from work one evening and he has something weighing on his mind. The man runs a bee farm and he's noticed that there are far fewer bees on his farm than there were the year before. His wife Sally has dinner all ready for him when he kind of walks into the door. So the whole family, the farmer, his wife, and the two children, they sit down to enjoy this meal together. The family are enjoying the meal. However, Sally notices that something's disturbing her husband. He doesn't appear to be the chipper self, which he usually is. She notices he's sort of hunched over and not looking at his family, which spurs Sally to ask, "Is everything okay, honey?" Her husband pauses for a second and delivers the news to his family. "Our farm has far fewer bees than it did last year. It's the strangest thing. I don't know where the bees have went." He said this in the fashion that got the whole family kind of thinking about it, even his 4-year-old. Oh yes, the man has a 4-year-old son. His name is Max, and he has a 7-year-old daughter Grace, and they too have put their little minds to work as to what his father's just said and why he's so upset about it. So Max kind of scratches his head and he starts to think he was stung by a bee two weeks ago, as there are lots of bees around the farm. Max thinks that it was because he got mad at the bees that they've all left the farm. So Max is sort of, I did this, Max, he thinks that he did it. He caused all the bees to go away because he didn't like them. You might be thinking that's ridiculous. Little Max isn't responsible for this. And really, I mean, he isn't. Maybe one bee has fled, but not the whole fleet of them because or died. But he's doing his very best. Max is living in a mental, emotional world where he often can't distinguish between feeling things into existence and events happening. So, his own thinking, his own being and thinking, he feels those thinking thoughts actually might cause things to happen in the world. So, I think that makes sense to you. Whereas thoughts and feelings in themselves actually change realities. In that sense, clouds follow him and bees leave him because he's angry at them without maybe even doing anything, right? He's living in an egocentric world space in that sense. So that's the kind of value system world space that he's kind of embodied in. Grace has a different story. She remembers her father telling her that bees have to do a lot of hard work for her dad. They work all day to make honey for us. Her father once told her, they fly all around collecting pollen. Grace thinks to herself, I wouldn't want to do all that work and not get an allowance for it. She thinks that they must have quit their work. They got sick of it, like she would, and just flew away. That must be it. Bees have to work too hard. Little Grace cannot think like bees. She's unable to understand that bees sort of think differently. So she's anthropomorphizing animals and insects. She's putting the mind of her into the mind of the animal or the insect, which is sort of a fancy way of saying she's putting human characteristics onto them. She's living in a world where everybody must think in the same way that she does, where she absolutizes reality. Things can happen and continue forever and ever. She's living in an ethnocentric space. And that might be a little bit of a construal because she knows probably that bees aren't humans. Usually we do this with things that look like ourselves, so maybe her friend. I'm just kind of using it as an example to kind of get you, because it's a comprehensive example. So it's a bit of a construal, but I think you get the idea there. So she's an ethnocentric world space. It's a different kind of thinking than her little brother Max, and a different kind of thinking that her mother and father will have, as we'll see. Sally, too, has been pondering this problem. She remembers reading in a magazine that there was a small group of scientists working on GMO crops, and that there were profound effects on these GMO crops on other life forms. Some of the tests showed cancer in mice, and that decreases increased when they were fed GMO foods. She has been worried for some time now about the long-term effects of humans eating GMO foods without sufficient testing on them. She reasons that because the crops her husband is working with now are GMO, and that the bees are in a different relationship with the crops, and the fact that some of these studies show negative effects on animals, maybe insects too, that there is the very real possibility that the GMO crops have caused the disappearance of bees. Sully's looking at the data objectively and creating a hypothesis. So she's at least working at a world-centric space, if not higher. And she very well might be looking at it in an even more complicated matter than a world-centric space. So that's at least the next step up from ethnocentric. And I think probably higher than that. That's a pretty, when I really look at it, she's kind of looking at things pretty complicated. Again, I had to fit the example, but... So in this case, no one's smart enough to be wrong 100%. 100% of the time, as Ken says. What this means is that despite the fact that these are three very different views on why the bees have disappeared, the three different views presented above all make certain sorts of sense within the world space in which they're coming from. In this case, egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric. Again, world-centric, it might be even beyond that. You might say planet-centric or something. Max really was angry. Grace really wouldn't want to do that much work without getting something back for it. And Sally really has thought about the implications of growing GMOs and that potential consequence on bees, whether or not it really was, the consequence. The correlation doesn't equal causation. But it does lead to the potentialities of thinking, and then you could test it and see if it, in other words, you could do a test crop where GMOs aren't in play and see if bees start to come back a bit and stuff like that. That would be empirically using that data, and that would be Sally's potential way of method. So Sally has done the most depth analysis here, there's no doubt about that. She's not only presenting a very plausible account about what happened and doing so logically, but she's not taking a definitive stance. She recognizes she doesn't have all the data and so must stop short on being certain about what has happened to the bees. So, okay, now let's move on to Grace. Grace correctly navigates the difficulties of work, and she knows that she doesn't like to work. So why the heck would bees want to work, right? That hard. They might want to do some work, but that much work? And then little Max actually accurately remembers that he got the bees angry. And he did. Maybe, at least that one bee he made maybe angry. All three have a degree of rightness or accuracy to their account. However, some accounts are more accurate or more holistic than others. Selly's probably takes more of reality into account and therefore is presenting a deeper account of the reality of the situation. Even if she's not getting exactly right, she might not. As there are deep complexities here. GMOs may be playing a role, for example, but they maybe aren't the whole cause of it either. There might be other factors that are in play too. Oftentimes that's the case. There are multiple things going on to cause things. So models of growth. Above, I use the simple model of egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric to cut different gradations of growth of consciousness. But it's important to remember that no map is going to give you perfect accounts of the territory. If you have a highway map, you expect the map to label certain major highway routes. But you don't expect to name every tree along the way, for example. Like Google Maps, there's some maps that show the territory from, say, 100,000 feet. And the detail in those maps aren't very good. But you have a very broad and sort of general perspective from 100,000 feet up. You can see all of North America, or maybe not that much, but you can see a lot of the territory compared to a map close up. But you can also zoom in and get more detail at 10,000 feet or 1 foot or a micrometer. You can go in very detailed. So likewise in our models of growth and development, we can use big picture accounts of growth and development, like the above with those 3 stages. That's a massively big, or very big, developmental spectrum from Max to Sally, for example. Or you can use more depth accounts of development with 10 or more stages of development. And we'll be looking at one with sort of 9 or 10. And then I'm going to go into one that I do as it's going to more integrate with panarchy later. So you can use multiple maps too of development. And I think some of the greatest thinkers do that. And we'll get into that a bit too. And it's important. You might see this is not important, but we need these maps to accurately dig into the conspiratorial landscape, because a lot of this stuff is in play in the thinkers about these topics and in the actors that, if they're doing it, have different kinds of mindsets that are causing them to do it. So we need to understand that mindset in a sophisticated way to be able to make any sort of real world changes. And that's just in the interior side. There's exterior things that need to be done too, but you need both. And oftentimes this sophisticated landscape is not talked about, and it's really needed. The one we will be focusing on below is somewhere in between with sort of 8 stages in that spiral dynamics. There are many different accounts of growth and development, and I will be going to, and I'm going to use other maps again, and I'm going to try to include them, at least in brief, throughout this book. This can be thought of in the following way. When we measure water temperature, we can use sort of both Fahrenheit and Celsius. So Fahrenheit has more granularity than Celsius. Fahrenheit has 180 degrees between freezing and boiling, whereas Celsius only has 100, right? This difference doesn't make one of them wrong. Rather, depending on the task or the country we're living in or some other variable, one of these methods of measurement might be better suited than the other. Growth of consciousness is real, and maps can be used to capture this reality. Just like how we measure water temperature, we use different maps depending on different circumstances. Some of them will have more depth and detail than others. Some of them will focus on certain stages, and some of them will be very grand and broad without very many details. All these maps can be used depending on the task at hand, and you can narrow those tasks to fit the application that you need. Bring in the map that you need to work with the particular task at hand. I also note that stages or levels of development look at the depth or complexity of the interiors of sentient beings. These levels or stages shouldn't be thought of as traditional hierarchies, but as dynamic, emergent qualities that unfold in somewhat of a mysterious fashion. But we'll dig into some of that mystery a little bit. It's important to note that the process of stepping into a new level or stage of consciousness also seems to involve a jump or leap to a new higher order of awareness. I've outlined a few of those examples in this chapter, but I'll provide a bare bones example of the levels of development now. And this is spiral dynamics. And again, this is a biopsychosocial map. I note in the preface there's integral theory, which has the 4 quadrants, and this takes into account those 4 quadrants in many respects, and then fleshes it out with a model of psychological growth. All that aside, for introductory purposes, I'll focus on Don Beck's spiral dynamics model. This developmental tool uses colors to mark the different stages. You may think this to be a silly practice, but it makes conversation on the topic much simpler, although it also leads to oversimplification sometimes. Throughout the book, I'll be using the Wilberian color scheme, and I might change that. I don't like the Wilberian color scheme. I actually think I'm going to change that on the fly when I might miss it a few times, but I like Don Beck's color scheme. I just did it. I don't know why I did that, but yeah. So I've listed his color schema under the heading and in bold alongside Keegan's level of perspective taking. So I'll note that now so that you know when I'm talking about one, I'm talking about the other, if I forget to bring it back to spiral dynamics colors, because again, I think it's the better model. I think that integral theory adopted their own color scheme as a promotional tool, and I really think that they did disjustice to Don Beck in doing so. Don had spent a lot of money trying to integrate it with integral theory's model, and I think again, yeah, Ken did a pretty rude act in doing that. So this particular model focuses on values. In other words, it looks at the questions, what do we deem important in life, or simply what do we value in life? As we probably expected, there are many possible answers to these questions, or different kinds of people will give different kinds of answers. I encourage you to think about what your highest values are before you carry on. This might be one of your best chances to gain real insight as to where your values fit into the developmental scale. Perhaps even jot them down when you finish thinking about these different developmental levels to try to figure out what's best schema, where in the schema you best fall, just so you have a skillful means. You can more easily negotiate your being in the world, your ability to negotiate different things, because this is not just going to be useful in the topic that I'm tackling here, conspiratorial notions. You can bring it into every domain of life, and in fact, that's mostly what integral theory does. They don't deal with these conspiracy things. This is something that I've taken on as a pet project, and I think needs to be taken on again. I think it's integral, but okay. Beige. This is spiral dynamics beige, and they call it the archaic stage. And in Wilbur's model, it's called infrared. So this started about 100,000 years ago. The stage is best described as survival-based. It is very primitive and was found in primitive man. Express self to meet imperative psychological needs through instincts of Homo sapiens. And I'm cut and copy a fair bit out of spiral dynamics directly in this. I'm just going to read it with that knowledge. Know that when I'm talking about these different levels, a lot of it's cut directly from them. This is their research, and they deserve all the credit for it. Archaic, instinctive, survivalistic, automatic, reflexological. The man is able to distinguish that the rocks and surrounding environment are not part of him or herself, but does not yet recognize that she is a separate mental being. This being can only understand that she is a separate physical being. That is, when I bite my thumb, with quotes around I and my thumb hurts, but the rock doesn't. I, again with quotations around it, am not that rock, because I don't really have a full conceptual picture of what I am yet, but I'm not that rock. Kind of know that. This being wouldn't have these words either to sort of express it. They're sort of pre-verbal oftentimes, or very, very low-level verbal. But the being would have an experience that results in roughly that understanding. Because these are biopsychosocial systems, it's important to point out that the other qualities of this stage of development, the above, is only the psychological. The social systems for such a mind is rather sort of hunter and gatherer or forager. fire makers that lived in probably cave-like settings in very, very small numbers of other humans. They're sort of pre-tribal. If you can really say there's a value system here, it would be something like valuing survival in many respects. You might think, well, I value that too, and you probably do. Most people do. Well, the theory posits that if you make a healthy developmental step, we transcend and include these earlier systems. In other words, you value survival plus other things. A question that might come to mind is, does that mean there are people on this planet that embody this particular value system? If so, they don't live exactly as those cave persons lived. So yes and yes. But the second has a yes with a but. Yes, there are people now that would be said to embody the value systems. The theory argues that we start at square one, and so babies, some straight people, or perhaps people living in third world conditions are primarily within this value system, or psychological or physiological survival. That is to say, people that live in third world Africa, their primary focus is survival, and they're either regressed to it or they have never moved past this. There's people with dementia, for example, might be in this state. Not a lot of people, but some people are still there. But as the second point suggests, conditions have changed, so a street person is not living in a cave or even socially as a person in the past with this developmental system. And most street people are far, far beyond this. A lot of street people are beyond people that do 9-to-5 jobs. So it's not distant, but some people on just strung out so hard that they can hardly stand up anymore. Those are the people that I'm talking about might maybe be in this position. So rather, they're on the streets sometimes with perhaps an industrial infrastructure surrounding them, and often brain damage due to extreme drug use or birth defects, etc. These realities will be playing a role in this being and their highest values. And of course, there are street people, again, with much more complexity. So there are just a few more important notices that we should show here, and these are exceptions and subtleties about this theory that are interesting. So here's how Chris Cohen and Don Beck, the writers of Spiral Dynamics, Mastering Values, Leadership, and Change, put it. Beige is virtually automatic state of existence. It's driven by the imperative psychological needs which dominate this system and trigger the very basic survival equipment with which we are born. With only this female active, one is clearly a human being, but barely recognizable as a personality. If higher order brain functions have never been activated, this is but a step beyond vegetative conditions. If more complex thinking did exist, physical illness, accident, or physiological trauma may have diminished access to it, thus causing beige to take over. So in these sort of circumstances, you might have been more advanced, but due to these sorts of traumas, you regress to beige. Tens of thousands of years ago, beige was sort of cutting edge. This was where humans were at, potentially, as long as our history is accurate. Question marks around that to some degree, but it was our ancestors' advantage over gorillas and woolly mammoths. Now, in Graves' words, it is the world of the physical infant, possibly the world of the simplest of food-gathering cultures, the world of the severely senile, the world of those who have regressed severely until the stress of war, the world of he who has been kept alive but can compassion or guilt of his fellow man, clearly no longer state-of-the-art thinking. So, we can think of people on life support and this sort of thing. It's a lot of these people are kept alive because of compassion of others. Not always, but oftentimes. So we still need adequate food and shelter and the cognitive apparatus we call the neocortex, or some sort of brain structure like it, to transition to the next stage. It's required. Some sort of decently healthy neocortex and all these other things. So purple. This is a magical way of thinking. Again, this is Wilber's infrared. But yeah, magical. So this started around 50,000 years ago, and this person's values emotional belongingness, the sense that the self is part of a group. The system, in other words, can be thought of in the following ways: animistic, tribalistic, or magical animistic, tribal order. Sacrifice to the ways of the elders and customs as one subsumed in the group. Here were the historical shamans, the tribal elders, and the medicine men. This is the beginning of the tribal system in very early human society, along with forms of early art and medicine. Those experiencing reality from this developmental stage may think that the clouds are following them, that they can become animals embodied by simply wearing a mask. These beings still do not have a clear sense that they are mental selves distinct from other mental selves. So that distinction is yet to be fully made. It's starting to be made, but it's not fully made. To eliminate exactly what this means, if someone wears an animal mask, they may sort of think they've taken on that animal being, imbibed it. They are becoming in part that animal. So, and when they take the mask off, they aren't that animal any longer. The spirit of that animal is no longer in them. So that distinction of self is so blurry that they think that mask can actually help make them a bit more like that animal, or take on the qualities of that animal. So this process may also, on occasion, be coupled with profound altered states, with the shamans like taking psychedelic drugs potentially, leading to some of the folklores that was passed down orally from social traditions. There's a level of mental distinctiveness within the system, but at this point, it's not that clear. So it's wavy. This stage ought to be not be idealized. Probably, often we do, but this is often the case in the pluralistic society, right? With getting sort of the back to nature kind of culture, we sort of idealize those primitive societies. And let me talk about why. So it's not uncommon with academia, for example, to talk about what a great thing it would be if we deindustrialized and lived as these late hunter-gatherers lived, being one with Gaia. And as we will see, there are profound dangerous movements underway pushing this agenda to some degree. I do think, living off the land, living sustainably, these are important moves to some degree, but I still see the techno-industrial aspect of it as we can find a way, I think, to integrate both, and that's what I'm going to suggest as an option. This is my opinion and misses a few crucial points, namely that such a life was short. Average age was probably about 30 years. It was nasty. You were subject to directly or indirectly environmental changes with little or no real protection against them, and very little cognitive capacities to cope with them. And it was brutal, as essentially there was no concept of value, and therefore human life was valueless in such a context. So that's the Hobbesian, short, brutish, and nasty. Murder, if it ever happened, wasn't probably that big of a deal. Here is Edward Harrison describing this worldview of the magic stage in its own terms. It's a vibrant universe awakened each day by the sun spirit and mourned each night by the moon spirit. Universe of starlight campfires across the night sky, of chromatic sky spirits manifesting as rainbows, sunsets, and northern lights, of mighty each spirit rumbling beneath the ground and spewing from volcanoes, or flittering little folk dwellers in secret places and stealing lost children. A magic universe haunted by the unborn and dead forever calling. Words cannot recall, nor the mind recapture the extreme vividness of this imagery. And again, we have this in us. It's an important aspect of our being in the world, to have an aspect of magical qualities, this sort of mystery of existence. You don't want to, hold it as your primary focus anymore. Transcend and include it. But I want to touch on something here. This is empirical data that they've assessed through different studies. So I'm going to dig into it more later, but just know that spiral dynamics is a well-refined sort of cross-cultural study that's taken place that really does suggest this is rigorous data. So I'm not just willy-nilly spilling this without sort of concrete data. There's a lot of, strong support that this is the case, that these developmental waves or patterns or stages do emerge. Some of Wilbur's stuff is a little bit more questionable, but I think a lot of it is still so very important that I'm going to be using him heavily throughout this, but just keep that in mind. So in the magical worldview, subject and object partially overlap, such that inanimate objects like rocks and rivers are directly felt to be alive or even to possess souls. Sacred places, objects, rituals, events, and stories can influence the world, and so must also be relied upon and protected. Tribal customs are passed down from an ancient lineage, including rites of passages and seasonal cycles. Safety and security are sought by bonding together and identifying, fusing with a tribe in order to preserve and protect outsiders from outsiders. Allegiance and admiration are given to the chief, parents, ancestors, customs and clans, mystical signs, and desires of powerful spirit beings must be followed for the continued safety and well-being of the tribe. So I'll let you think about that for a sec. I'm just going to plug in this phone because I don't want it to die in the midst of this process. This will just take literally a few seconds. As I said, this is probably going to run 2 hours.